Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to talk about the missional theological significance of the tabernacle narrative in the book of Exodus. In particular, I'm going to focus on the actual climactic passage of the book, Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 to 38. Let's hear these words, and then I'm going to back up, give some framing, and then go through some of the key points that it's important for you to see if you're going to understand this passage. So the book concludes this way. First, at the end of verse 33, so Moses finished the work. And one of the themes that we're going to see is that in the tabernacle, it's very detailed, and Moses leads Israel to build the tabernacle exactly and precisely as Yahweh had instructed. Okay? Now, and then this is what happens. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey. So that's how the book ends, with God's presence dwelling among God's people as God leads the people on mission, right? So you want to notice that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But let's give it a little bit of framing here. Now, what's important to see is that the tabernacle narrative, and again, we read chapter 40, verses 34 to 38. This is the climax of the entire book, but it's set up in an interesting way. Now, what's actually happening here is we get a case study here on faithfulness. Because what's the response of God's peoples to God's grace? It's faithfulness. God delivers them from Egyptian slavery at the beginning of the book, and then offers them covenant. And covenant is the way that Israel responds to grace, and God called them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to be God's special possession out of all the nation, so that through Israel the world can know the Lord. Okay. Now, at the end of the book, we get the process by which the holy God, Yahweh, is going to dwell with his people, and we get two contrasts. So notice that the tabernacle materials are chapter 25 to 31, and then 35 to 40. Now, in the middle of that is the golden calf narrative, which is essentially Israel's fall, and I invite you to go back and look at the previous video. This is all about the extreme danger of idolatry and syncretism. That's what the golden calf represented. So this is the threat. This is the threat to Israel's future. This is the threat to Yahweh's presence going with God's people. And again, it's interesting. If you pull this passage out and push 25 to 31 together with 35 to 40, you wouldn't know anything was missing. Take a look at the end of chapter 31. What's it talking about? It's talking about the Sabbath. Guess what 35 starts with? The Sabbath. Now, the distinction between these two sections is 25 to 31 are the precise instructions for how God's people are to construct a portable Mount Sinai. That's what the tabernacle actually is. It's a portable Mount Sinai. And so we have the instructions here, and then guess what? When Israel constructs the tabernacle, they do it, and we have this recurring phrase that runs through this sections. They do it exactly as the Lord had commanded Moses. So this is all about obedience. And so disobedience, idolatry, syncretism, or faithful obedience, and you get two contrasting things that happen. Because what's the difference here? This is a massive contrast. The golden calf created essentially a threat to Israel's future. Because when you read this and Moses intercedes on Israel's behalf, the issue is, will God go with God's people to the promised land? But we notice the opposite of that. When God's people practice faithfulness, what really happens? The presence of the Lord comes down and fills the tabernacle, and God leads God's people to the promised land. So it's really important to see some differences here. And just notice a couple of things, right? The golden calf, built hastily, built simply. Tabernacle, incredibly complicated. That gives Aaron some gold. There's an overwhelming offering that goes for the tabernacle, right? And so there's some contrast that you want to notice here. And so that's important. Now, so what exactly is the tabernacle? And what we have here, this is a picture from page 808 of the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch that's published by InterVarsity. And I want you to notice first the size. It's 75 feet wide by 150 feet long. So this isn't a huge structure, though it's pretty good size. So you have this courtyard here, and there are other implements here, but we have the altar where the sacrifices will be made is made in the courtyard. So there's going to be an entrance. And then this would be the covered area where we have a sacred space. And then there's the Holy of Holies here, and the Ark of the Covenant is going to reside here. So exactly what is the tabernacle? The tabernacle is essentially a big tent. And it's constructed, it's based on, it's the means by which the Lord, who reveals himself on Mount Sinai, allows Israel basically to take Mount Sinai with them wherever they go. So this is what you could call, it's a big portable tent shrine. Again, allows God's holiness, holy presence to dwell with the people. And it's also important to notice how they camped out. So the tabernacle would be at their center. So essentially God would reside in the center of Israel. Israel camps around this. And again, they didn't camp in circles. They would have the tribes laid out. But the idea here is Yahweh's actual holy presence, his glory, is in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies. Again, there's going to be a whole priesthood and stuff that's going to take care and operationalize the tabernacle. That's the role of what the book of Leviticus does. But essentially what this does then, again, Israel's to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Israel mediates the good news of God to the rest of the world. So that's what the tabernacle lets them do. It allows a holy God to dwell with God's people. Okay? Now, let me make a few concluding exegetical remarks on this. Now, first of all, this is the climax, Exodus 40, 34 to 38. So the climax of the book of Exodus is not the plagues. It's not the Passover. It's not the Red Sea. So it's not the deliverance from Israel. The climax isn't the Sinai covenant per se. The true climax is part of the Sinai covenant when God's glory dwells with God's people, when God comes off his sacred mountain and dwells powerfully with God's people. And notice the contrast here. When we started in the book back in Exodus 1 and 2, God felt absent, right? God's people were in slavery. God doesn't come down to do anything. So total contrast with the beginning of the book at the end of the book. Now we have God's real presence filling the tabernacle and now guiding God's people as they go forth on mission. Now, the entire tabernacle narrative is loaded with creation imagery. It's all about restoration. So in a sense, the instructions on how to build the tabernacle sort of echo back to Genesis when there were careful instructions given to Moses on how to build the ark. Okay? So this is all about restoration. There's also 7 pieces of instruction to Moses, which I think is supposed to echo the 7 days of creation. So there's creation themes. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive in this, carefully look at Terence Fredheim's work, specifically his interpretation commentary on Exodus. He's loaded. He's really good with talking about the creational themes. Now also we have the issue of God's guiding presence. So we have this missional thing. I like to call this part Israel as sacrament. Because what we have are God's people with God's presence, and they mediate that to the world. That's what I was trying to show on the previous piece of paper with the circles. So Israel functions as a sacrament as God guides them towards the promised land. When they're parked, God's glory comes down into the Holy of Holies, and when God's guiding them, there's a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to lead God's people into the world. Again, I think at some level, Jesus' Great Commission echoes this, where Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you always unto the end of the earth. Follow me." It's that idea God guides God's people into mission in the world. There's an issue in the Exodus 34 to 38 uses both language of the tent and also the tabernacle itself. And those who've been reading through Exodus know that there's a tent of meeting that shows up on and off in Exodus 32 to 34 that's outside of the camp. Because of Israel's sin with the golden calf, there's an issue: is God's presence going to abide with God's people? Well, as Moses contests with God and goes through these intercessions, Moses has to go outside the camp and go into this tent. And this is where Moses glows and stuff during this part of the book as well. And so why do you have this overlapping language, and are there two tents? Well, it seems like there are two tents. And they get conflated together here at the end because I think it's a way of signaling that that time of exclusion is over and the tabernacle is now going to be where it belongs, in the middle of God's people. So the tent of meeting that Moses used in 32 to 34 shifts, and now the focus becomes the tabernacle. And we also want to notice here that Moses is unable to enter in. And that's because Moses' role is going to shift. Moses is the lawgiver. He's the giver of the Torah. And he's forever going to be that person, the book of the law that came from Moses. But now this is about God's holiness. And the book of Leviticus operationalizes the tabernacle. That's what Leviticus is all about. It has rules for sacrifices, it has how to ordain priests, and it has all of the regulations that are going to guide Israel so that they can have a holy God abiding in their presence. So Moses takes on a new role. Now, if you're looking for a theology of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament, this is one of the places where the Spirit has a powerful role. Specifically, in chapter 31, verses 1 to 11, back when Israel's creating the tabernacle, God, it says, of two men, Bezalel and Oholiab, that I have filled them with a divine spirit, and they give them skills so that they can build these things. And what we see in the tabernacle is not only the role of the Holy Spirit, but we also see the priesthood of all believers, because this isn't just about one or two people building the tabernacle. This is, when you read these texts carefully, Israel abundantly participates. In fact, there's so much resources and so many volunteers, they can't even use all of these things. So there's an overflowing of the Holy Spirit that guides God's people to faithfully build the tabernacle, which leads then to God's presence in their midst. And then when you look towards the New Testament, I want to point to a couple of things. We're going to end up in Revelation, but I want also to note John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word there for dwelt in Greek comes from the word skene, which is for tent. So in other words, you could translate this: the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And so the tabernacle does two things. It foreshadows the incarnation of Jesus where we truly get Emmanuel, God with us. And it also foreshadows the ultimate consummation of all things, which we see in Revelation 21:3, where at the end, as God's kingdom is fully revealed and we get a new heaven and a new earth, we said, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. You know, that language there, that echoes back to what we saw in Exodus 6, where it says, I will be their God, they will be my people. Notice that reaches its full consummation in the new heaven and the new earth. So, that's the book of Exodus. It ends with this. And so I just challenge those of you who may just be, that often it's really tempted to skip over the tabernacle materials. There's really powerful pieces here, and this just scratches the surface. If you have other questions, please send them in to me. And I want you to know it's an absolute privilege to be able to offer some ideas about this portion of the book of Exodus with you. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others.